My name is John Becker, host of the Debrief podcast and the founder of Aardvark Tactical. This is a new short-form podcast series from the Debrief. In each episode, we will discuss a single aspect of leadership in depth with subject matter experts who operate in high-stress environments inside and outside of the tactical community. The goal of this series is to give you direct access to the men and women whose leadership skills have been tested in the world's most dangerous situations and to provide you with specific, actionable information that you can use to hone your leadership skills. This is Battle-Proven Leadership. My guest today is Gareth Lock. Gareth spent 25 years in the Royal Air Force as a flight instructor, a navigator on the C-130 Hercules, a system engineer, and a requirements manager. Following his retirement from the RAF in 2015, he started to work in high-risk industries teaching human factors and crew resource management. Eventually, Gareth turned his attention to diving, applying a military systems approach to diving risk management by creating an organization called the Human Diver, which is focused on what they describe as Counter-Errorism. Specifically, Gareth and his team provide training globally to high-reliability and high-risk organizations on leadership, culture, and practical measures to improve operator safety. In 2019, Gareth led a team of military experts to undertake a review of the UK military diving with the goal of improving diver safety. Gareth has worked with the U.S. National Park Service, Submerged Resource Center, the New Zealand National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research, and the American Academy of Underwater Sciences to provide human factors training and high-performance team development courses. Gareth is the author of a book, Under Pressure, Diving Deeper with Human Factors, which looks at case studies of near disasters and applies academic theory to understanding how we can better communicate and lead those in high-risk, high-reliability units. I'm excited to have Gareth on because of his views on human fallibility, although they're rooted in diving, have broad lessons to teach anyone who leads others, especially those working in high-risk areas. Gareth, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for the invite. Really looking forward to it.
I'd love to explore this notion of counter-errorism. I love the notion of it. Why don't we start with where you came up with looking at human fallibility through a lens of diving?
So my background, is just sort of touched on in the introduction, as being military aviation. And as I started through my military career, aviation career, mid-90s, start to mid-90s, we adopted this concept called crew resource management from the civil aviation sector. And it's this recognition that actually we're all fallible, we all make mistakes. And I think that's a critical factor from aviation. You know, you go back 50 years, pilots were last to touch it, it's your fault. And it wasn't until they started to look at cockpit voice recorders and flight data monitors, flight data recorders, that realized that actually these weren't stupid people. They knew that something was developing, but they couldn't express it amongst their crew. So they started with cockpit resource management, so talking about communication and assertion skills, and then realized that actually some of the cabin crew would know stuff that was going wrong and that the flight deck crew didn't. So they extended it to crew resource management, and now it becomes threat and error management. But the basis is that we make mistakes. So in 2005, I was on a trip with work out to San Diego, diving in Wreck Alley, and I had a near miss. A piece of equipment didn't work properly. I sank to the bottom to 100 feet, resolved the issue, carried on the dive. Got back to the UK and went, I'd like to report this. How do I share that learning? Because that's something that comes from aviation as normal. And I couldn't find something. That sort of piqued my interest. How do we improve reporting and learning in diving? And part of that is you've got to understand the fact that we're fallible. We all make mistakes. We make mistakes in a consistent manner. So actually, it's not about the actions and the outcomes that we should be looking at. It's the context, because the context shapes the behavior. So we can create error-likely situations or error-resilient situations. And that's what I was trying to bring into the diving space. And diving is an interesting, it's predominantly sports diving, although I've done work with military diving and scientific diving as well. The majority of the diving that takes place out there is at an individual level. So the perception of risk and acceptance is really big as a factor, because there's no supervisory framework. Once you've done a training course, then actually you're out on your own. There's no continual professional development as such. So it's very different to how an organization would manage risk. Although the risks might be the same, they're managed differently. And what I was trying to bring is actually it starts with education. And so that's been my sort of passion for the last 7 years or so.
I love it. I've been a PADI dive master since like 1995. And, one of the things that has always struck me with diving in particular is that the people who are responsible for policing it benefit economically from it being safe.
Perceptually economically safe. Yeah.
Perceptually safe. Perceptually safe, right? Like, and it's always, it wasn't until I started diving with my kids that I began to appreciate, how great less than 60 feet of water is. But it's interesting because there is a lesson learned there, I think, in that, we tend to trust others with our safety without really questioning whether they really are looking at safety or simply trying to derive, an appearance of safety. And it's one of the things that caught my eye initially. It was actually one of our listeners that turned me on to your work. And as I started to dive into it, there were a lot of things that stuck out to me that I really liked, because you could see the military aviator system mindset in everything you write.
Yeah.
But it's not written as an aviation guy. It's written, kind of as a diver and leadership and culture, which is why I think it's so applicable to what we do.
Yeah. And one of the things that I try to get across to people, because I work in multiple domains, is that human factors is general in nature and specific in application. And that's a double-edged sword. So the general in nature piece, people go, it's just common sense. I wouldn't do that. And you sit there and go, well, actually, it is. And it's trying to solve their problems. And that portability requires a shift in mindset to say, what can I learn from somebody else? And that's a huge mindset shift for most people, because you sit there and go, I wouldn't make that mistake. So what I turn it around is I look at the rationale or the logic behind the failure, and then talk about something they can relate to. And that might be about forgetting. So you walk out the front door and you hear the door go click. You go, keys are in the house. Now, when you forget something, you won't remember it until there is a memory trigger that brings it back. And in the case of that, it's the click of the door, which matches a subconscious pattern that says door, lock, keys, bugger, keys are in the house. And so people can relate to that. And then you segue into their work environment. So that the whole purpose of the training that I try to deliver is to reduce the jeopardy involved in the learning, because people are very proud of their identity, their tribalism, their profession, and they don't want to look stupid unless they've got a huge mindset shift that said, you know what, I will make mistakes, and it doesn't matter if I do.
Well, and I think organizationally, it's one of the things that we see, I deal with teams all over the world, and teams have a risk tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
And that risk tolerance largely revolves around how they perceive risk. Is risk somebody did something stupid and made a mistake, or is risk a constant companion that you have to guard against? I remember early on, I had a friend that was an Air Force pilot, and, we were talking through kind of, starting up, and he's like, we're going through the checklist. And I said, like, you're a friggin' fighter pilot. Why are you going through a checklist? And he said, because if I don't go through a checklist, eventually I'll forget something. And when I do, I may kill myself or others. So you use a checklist, and it's not a question of, are you a good enough pilot to not use a checklist? It's a question of, what is the consequence of making a mistake, and how do I avoid doing that? Mm-hmm. And I think that, one of the things that I've read about and we talked about is this kind of idea of transferring knowledge to other people, right? And the ability, and I would love for you to touch on that for me, because I think the way that you put it earlier was really interesting.
Yeah, so the ability to abstract information or transfer information. So if you and I have got a common knowledge, so we've got a military background, so we already talked about some acronyms, and you said some stuff and I knew exactly what you talk about. And then you went off in a little bit and I joined the dots and I came up with what we were, we got this common knowledge. So there's a paper I read recently as part of my master's, just looking at the amount of information that needs to be transferred is based on the listener's knowledge and context. So if you and I have a huge overlap of knowledge, I only need to transfer, I'm going to make up some numbers, 1 or 2% of the message because we've got a shared understanding of the other 98%. But if you know nothing about that, I have to spend so much longer explaining the context. And we just talked about a scenario of Blue Force Tracker or IFF, that you would have to explain why you would need something like that as a capability before you could then get into talking about things. And this same paper from Dave Snowden is talking about knowledge without context is meaningless. So we've got to have some level of shared understanding. And that's why joint training, joint dialogue is incredibly important. And if you're then going to move knowledge from one space to another, you've got to have people who've got general knowledge. And I touched on a book called Range by David Epstein. This ability to operate as a generalist in a world of specialisms. And those generalists are the people that can connect. Like in my space, I'm talking in the diving space. I'm talking with you in terms of armor and high threat environments, of special forces, of police teams. I've just finished with a police trainer. I've got chat tomorrow with safety engineer. I've got somebody else who's on Thursday, works in software space. And because people are broadly wired the same way, it's just the stories that change. And so to me, there's multiple dimensions in this. But ultimately, if you can think in bigger context, then you can take learning, you can abstract it from multiple spaces and take it from the work that I do in oil and gas and healthcare and software and dive. Because you know what? We're all human. We all broadly behave the same way and recognize that that's the case. And we don't sit there and go, that lesson doesn't apply to me because I'm not a SWAT operator or I'm not a diver or I'm not a paramedic. Yeah, you are.
Yeah, I think it's, and part of the reason that we're doing this Battle Proven Leadership series is to kind of bring experts from areas adjacent to the tactical market to our end users and to kind of give them, like you said, human factors are all common. It's the application that varies, but a safety culture is a safety culture. And a good safety culture in an airplane is a good safety culture, on a deep dive is a good safety culture, in a parachute jump is a good safety culture in a veterinary practice. And so that's why I think it is such an interesting conversation to have. Talk to me.
Just on that, I was going to say, just before we go on that, about the safety culture. And interestingly, the safety culture to me is this recognition that there are always trade-offs that exist within the system. You've got a margin of maneuver, you've got some resources, you've got some finances, and you've got acceptable performance. And a safety culture is the acceptance that you will bounce around things and you're trying to stay as close to the margin as your resources and also public opinion are willing to accept. So from an aviation point of view, they're incredibly safe because of all the processes put in place, but also because the public don't like aircraft crashing. So there's a public perception of what's an acceptable level of risk as well. And that will drive the operational perspective of what can we afford to fail or not.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that we talk about is that there's series of risk tolerances that overlap. There's a risk tolerance. Every individual has a risk tolerance. Every team or unit has a risk tolerance. Every department has a risk tolerance, and those three circles connect, and they're not concentric, right? Like,
and they're dynamic too.
Yeah, and they're constantly moving. And so I think part of a safety culture is defining the inviolate rule, right? Like it's for me, my business protects tactical operators. Number one is operator safety. That is in our priority. There is nothing more. Profit isn't more important than that. Expediency, on-time delivery, none of those things outweigh safety. And so you always know in the back of your head, we're going to have to make a trade, but this is what we're not going to trade.
Yeah.
And I think that, we talk about priority life in tactical environment where, there are certain things that are worth more than others. A hostage is worth more than a suspect.
Yep.
Always, right? A police officer's life is worth more than a suspect's life.
Mm-hmm.
Always. But a hostage's life is worth more than a police officer's life.
Mm-hmm.
Right? In the same way that a fighter pilot is we've already made a decision that we're willing to risk his life for the mission we send him on.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we're going to risk his life for something that isn't part of the mission, right? We're not going to make a stupid decision that's going to get him killed, needlessly or unnecessarily. So I think, one of the things that I've heard you talk about that I think ties in here is this notion of learning to fail safely. What do you mean? Talk to me about that.
So learning to fail safely is this concept that says, we are going to make mistakes. It doesn't matter how skilled, how high performing we are, there is going to be something go wrong. So what are your contingencies? Now, when I work in the health and safety space, it's about potentially where energy is transferred. It might be a dropped object, it might be a fallen object, it might be something breaks free. And so recognizing, so as an example, it might be you're doing a crane lift and you create an exclusion zone underneath the lifting operation because you can't guarantee that the lifting operation will not fail. So you're in a situation where if it fails, the load falls, it doesn't crush anybody. It might destroy the load, but hey, whoopee, we can deal with that. In the context of tactical operations, armor is one of those. It might be that actually we don't commit to this because it's considered too risky for what we're trying to do. And so we've got to look at the contingencies, the plan A, which is the primary one, your B, C, and D, using concepts like red team thinking, not just the tactical safety, the individual safety, but what's the reputational risk of this? How do we mitigate that? Do you have a comms plan in place that says when the proverbial hits the fan, how do we minimize that that fallout as much as possible? So failing safely is not just a personal safety thing, it's all of the other risks that you're managing as an organization: reputation, finance, credibility, people's lives, tactics, procedures, comms, all of those things have got a risk associated with them. So how do you mitigate when the proverbial hits the fan? How do you make sure that they don't have a catastrophic outcome?
What are your as you're teaching this, what are the key concepts that you think an end user needs to understand in that planning process? Like what sticks out to you? I said, hey, you've got 5 minutes with this leader. What are you going to try to convey to him?
That his team have probably got a better idea than he does. And by that, I mean using the diversity of thought within your team. So you may come up with a plan and intentionally go in there and say, pick holes in it. Tell me where I'm going wrong. And going in with that sort of vulnerable approach, which I know is difficult because they're in a leadership position, they're in a supervisory position. That's why they're there. But they will have a biased view about how to solve that problem. Now, bias is often constrained as or described as a negative thing. A bias is just an offset from what it should be. And so it could be good or it could be bad. So to me, the most important thing is recognizing that you've got experts in your team, because otherwise you wouldn't have them. Use that expertise to develop and give you, as a colleague of mine, optionality. It's about, we can't mitigate everything that's going to go wrong, but at least if we talk about it, then we might be able to think about it in advance as opposed to trying to play on the hoof. I think the phrase of plans are useless, planning is essential, because the plan never survives first contact. But if you've planned and tried to pick your plan apart rather than try to plan why your plan is good, then actually you've got a better idea, or you've got a better chance of surviving when things go south.
I teach a block on culture-centric leadership, and one of the things I stress in that is your job as a leader is to get to the right answer. It is not to have the right answer.
Absolutely.
And I think so often we get caught up in, I don't want to look like I don't know what I'm doing, or I don't want to look like I'm unsure. And in the process, you marginalize, the guy that knows more about this is not you, right? You as
Yes.
a leader are a generalist by definition. And so this idea that, as a generalist, you're going to know more than a specialist does is just stupid. It's just, it is a game of ego
Yeah.
that ultimately adds in a margin of danger that doesn't have to be there.
Totally. And you just said something there which triggered a thought. And there's I don't know who said it, that words make worlds. And so you said, I don't have the right answer. And it's this bit of trying to get to the right answer. And I would think in an uncertain, complex space, the answer is close enough. It's not right. There
Yeah.
won't be a right answer. And it's that bit of, are we happy with the level of uncertainty that we're engaging in this situation? And it might be the clock is forcing your hand, so you don't have a choice. But are we happy? When people talk about risk, to me, and the sort of literature shows up the difference between risk, which is a logical, countable, measurable thing, and uncertainty, which is often managed through emotions and heuristics and biases. The tactical space is not a risk space. There's no way you can measure quantitatively what the risk is, but you are measuring or trying to manage uncertainty as best you can.
Well, and I think that kind of brings up the need. I've heard you say that foresight is 2020. Hindsight is 2020. Foresight never is, right? So I think it does conjure this notion that we're never going to be able to see all the potential downsides, but we retrospectively always need to look for why we made the decisions we did and how we could have made different decisions when things don't go well. What are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree. And I would say that even though with hindsight, we can look back and we think we've got 2020, it's not quite there. And part of the problem is our judgment is clouded by the outcomes. We suffer from hindsight bias. We suffer from outcome bias. We don't look at the quality of the decision when we end up with an adverse outcome. We judge it really harshly, and that's human nature. So the need to look back and reflect, and just again changing the language subtly, moving from why did you do that to how did it make sense to do that? Because why invites a judgment or a clarification against a standard or an expectation. But if you turn around and say, how did it make sense? Now I'm de-identifying or depersonalizing the question, and I'm asking you to explain your rationale. And it might be, I don't know. All right, now we can start to unpick what it is that you saw, what it is you smelled, felt, tasted. What were the patterns that were going on? What we're trying to do is create that local rationality, because after the effect, we can join the dots really easily. And often we think there is only one or two decisions available. But in real time going forward, we have multiple possibilities, multiple probabilities, and we make the best guess about what is likely to do, because we can only execute one action and we make the best guess as to what we think is going to give us the successful outcomes, whatever those are. And that means we have to unpick the decision-making and the local rationality that's there.
But I think we need to do it dispassionately too, right? It's one of the things that I liked what you said, because one of my work sayings is fix problems, not blame.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care whose fault it is. I really, truly, at this point in my career, don't care whose fault it is. When something goes wrong, I don't want to go, oh man, that's Gareth's fault.
Yeah.
What I want to know is, how did we get here?
Yes.
How did this decision, this mistake, this error happen? And what is wrong systemically that this could occur?
Yep. So a question there is, what conditions led to this happening in the way it did? And again, you're moving away from people. And even if you're talking about their decision-making process, you can then say, what are the mental models they were matching against? What was the schema that they'd been experienced and had they experienced in the past that matches their decision-making process? So looking at the conditions that shape and influence decisions. And that's not about getting rid of the accountability that's there. it's about really exploring the situation. And accountability in that sense is forward-looking accountability, telling an account about how it made sense and what can we do differently in the future. And more importantly, how do we fix that?
I recently interviewed Bob Kuntz, who was a nuclear submarine commander. And one of the things that I love that Bob talked about was this idea of tripwires, which is
Mm-hmm.
that there are certain things that when they occur, we're going to take the decision out of your hand and you're going to do this.
Yeah.
Because when those things occur, you have already stepped into that, if to think of it in terms of aviation thinking, you've moved at least a link down the chain,
Yes.
right? Right. You've begun to move down a road that could end catastrophically. So as a result, if X happens, we do Y.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, being able to do retrospective looks and say, hey, God, how did that happen? And oh man, that was a close call. How could we have prevented that? And then starting to establish, well, when this happens, if these two conditions occur, we're out.
So interestingly, the bit there was how would we prevent this from happening? Creates a situation where we automatically jump to a solution. So if you can suspend that question and then say, what are the conditions that led to this, and create an understanding of the situation first, then we've got a better understanding of what can we put in place. Because if we jump straight to the how could we will automatically go into the solution space. And I've just finished another discussion with somebody recently about the need to understand what normal looks like. So accidents, adverse outcomes occur as deviations from normal, not as deviations from standards or rules. Now, normal might align with standards, but often it doesn't, because people will adapt and evolve and modify their behaviors. And they're managing that capacity all the time until some condition, it might be a distraction, it might be a personal issue, a mental overload, or it could be a manufacturing fault in a piece of equipment. It's those bits that we need to look at that led to a loss of capacity to manage safe operations.
That's a very interesting point. Yeah, I think also there has to be a recognition that in your world or my world, you're dealing with a high threat, high stress environment, right? It is a pass-fail exercise, and
Yes.
human beings are inherently fallible. And I think that one of the sayings in our industry is it used to be you'll rise to the level of your training. And that quickly went away to no, actually you will fall to the level of your lowest level of training.
Yeah.
On an individual basis, what do you think is the best approach to ensure the decrease of individual error? How do we take people in high stress environments and help them to make good decisions at the moment of the event?
Be creative in your training environment. To start with, you've got to recognize that we're going to be fallible and people have to accept their fallibility. So what I would say is the first piece is remove the jeopardy when you're dealing with learning to deal with failure in this first place, which is difficult because often people want to go straight into a professional training environment and there is some scope for them to lose face or credibility amongst themselves. So if you can get a training environment where everybody starts at ground zero, everybody is learning from scratch, and then get people to fail in that environment. So the first piece there. Then it's this bit that says actually, and I sort of touched on it just now, learning from normal work. So you don't have to have a failure to learn. Again, that's about teaching people to reflect on the activity, because often near misses, people don't even recognize they've had a near miss because they have a pat in the back and they go, awesome, well done, move on. And especially in organizations where they reward people for achieving goals and they don't reflect on it. So that means that you've got to have a standard or a structure for having a debrief that allows you to understand what normal work looks like and what abnormal work looks like, where you've got an incident or accident that's happened. So if you can get the mindset about learning from normal, then actually when bad things happen, it's not so much of a problem when you go to learn.
Yeah. So you debrief no matter what. You
Yes.
debrief when you're
Yeah.
successful, you debrief when you fail, and there is no difference in the initial approach to those two events. I think
Absolutely.
that is a space where there is a gaping hole um, in a lot of units because
Hmm.
they will debrief if something went really wrong. Like, oh man, that okay, yeah, we should probably have a quick debrief. Um, and the units that I see that have the right safety culture and that are, at the pointy end, for lack of a better
Yeah.
term, um, they debrief everything.
Yeah.
There is
It's
always a
a
discussion.
non-negotiable. From my experience of sort of operations, flying operations, and the training missions, that actually the sortie was not over until the debrief had finished, and so it's a non-negotiable. It happens, and that could be just a simple passing of what do we do well, why, what do we need to improve on, and how. And those are four simple questions. And I've got a debrief framework that looks at that in a little bit more detail. But importantly, why did it go well and how do we improve are the important questions. The observations of what went well and what do we need to improve, they're easy. The real thinking power comes into why did it go well and how do we improve, and the need to dig into specifics, not generalities.
Yeah, I think that is possibly the most valuable thing that, the safety discussion can evolve is a culture of we are going to learn from everything we do. Sometimes
Yeah.
we'll learn we did it well, but if a debrief becomes down to we only talk about it when it goes bad, we're not learning. And I recently had a conversation with a team that had a really close call. They were describing an operation, and the guy said, "Man, the guy shot through the door and missed my head by about 3 inches." And he's like, "But I mean, everything turned out okay." So
Yeah.
like, and it was just this kind of notion of like, "Oh yeah, no, I mean, the operation was a complete success because nobody got killed." And it's like, well, dude, you just said a round went by your head by 3 inches. Better aim changed the outcome. How did it change your
Yeah.
operations? And he goes, "Well, it didn't because it was a success."
Yeah. And,
So
and so there's the bit of if you only run a debrief when things go wrong and things aren't perceived as going wrong, the value of the debrief disappears. But if the value of the debrief is learning, even when things go well, you can reinforce or improve on the stuff that went better. And that I think is the improvement mindset, and a blog that I recently wrote about, near misses, the fact of were you lucky or were you good? And asking that question, oh yeah, we were good. All right, tell me what you did and can you replicate it on the next two or three activities in the same scenario? Oh, actually, we were probably lucky then. Right, fine. And accept that you were lucky. Right, how do we increase the certainty that we will get the outcome that we want and reduce the uncertainty of we might not?
that's fantastic. So I want to link. We'll link in the show notes to
Mm-hmm.
the papers that we talked about, the book that we talked about. How can people find you if they want to? Like I follow you on LinkedIn and read a lot of the stuff you post there. But what's the best way for people to learn more about your work?
Thehumandiver.com. So www.thehumandiver.com. There's about 150 blogs on there, which predominantly are diving related, but we just talk about the ability to abstract from one space to another. And you can find that. The book that I wrote is available on Amazon, Kindle, ebooks, and Audible as well. So you can get that. Again, it's diving related, but there's a lot of theory that is linked in with the stories that are told. And I purposely shaped it in the way of storytelling because people learn through the stories and they can relate to the theory that's in the chapter to the stories as they develop.
Yeah, and I've read a number of your blogs, and although they are diving related, they are not diving related. Like diving is the context through which you are teaching, but it very well could be aviation or playing soccer or something else. It's just diving is the space that you're doing this teaching through. But I would encourage our listeners to definitely follow your work because there are a lot of deep lessons learned and again, it's a pass fail. We learned recently with the Titan submarine. It is a
Yeah.
pass fail exercise at the highest order. So we end each episode with 3 questions, and so The goal here is a quick answer, 1 or 2 sentences, and I just kind of want your gut reaction. What is
Okay.
your most important habit?
Um, I would say be curious. So it's that bit of how did it make sense for somebody to do what they did? Whenever you will get a gut reaction that says, "Oh my God, how do they do that?" And then let that pass. Be curious and understand local rationality. Viewing the world through that lens is incredibly enlightening.
Local rationality. You've added a word to my vocabulary. What is the most important thing for building an effective team?
One thing, humility, I would say, for everybody.
What do you think the one thing every leader should know is?
That they don't know everything, which is linked to the other bit. And the discussion we've had earlier is recognizing that your job is to point people in the right direction and to focus them, but your team have got the expertise to solve the problem. And that team is a general piece. It's not just one person in the team. The emergent knowledge or the convergent knowledge that's within there will be way greater than each individual can contribute.
Gareth, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for being with me and teaching me, man.
Thank you very much, John. I loved it, and I'll send over the stuff for you. Thank you.